Inventing the Future. Postcapitalism and a World Without Work. By Nick Srnicek and Alex Williams. Chapter 1. Our Political Common Sense, Introducing Folk Politics. The next move was ours, and we just stood there, waiting for something to happen, like good conscientious objectors awaiting our punishment after our purely symbolic point had been made. Dave Mitchell. Today it appears that the greatest amount of effort is needed to achieve the smallest degree of change. Millions march against the Iraq War, yet it goes ahead as planned. Hundreds of thousands protest austerity, but unprecedented budget cuts continue. Repeated student protests, occupations and riots struggle against rises in tuition fees, but they continue their inexorable advance. Around the world, people set up protest camps and mobilize against economic inequality, but the gap between the rich and the poor keeps growing. From the alter-globalization struggles of the late 1990s, through the anti-war and ecological coalitions of the early 2000s, and into the new student uprisings and Occupy movements since 2008, a common pattern emerges: resistance struggles rise rapidly, mobilize increasingly large numbers of people, and yet fade away only to be replaced by a renewed sense of apathy, melancholy and defeat. Despite the desires of millions for a better world, the effects of these movements prove minimal. A funny thing happened on the way to the protest. Failure permeates this cycle of struggles, and as a result, many of the tactics on the contemporary left have taken on a ritualistic nature, laden with a heavy dose of fatalism. The dominant tactics, protesting, marching, occupying, and various other forms of direct action, have become part of a well-established narrative, with the people and the police each playing their assigned roles. The limits of these actions are particularly visible in those brief moments when the script changes. As one activist puts it, of a protest at the 2001 Summit of the Americas. On April 20, the first day of the demonstrations, we marched in our thousands towards the fence, behind which 34 heads of state had gathered to hammer out a hemispheric trade deal. Under a hail of catapult-launched teddy bears, activists dressed in black quickly removed the fence's supports with bolt cutters and pulled it down with grapples as onlookers cheered them on. For a brief moment, nothing stood between us and the convention center. We scrambled atop the toppled fence, but for the most part we went no further, as if our intention all along had been simply to replace the state's chain link and concrete barrier with a human one of our own making. End of quotation. We see here the symbolic and ritualistic nature of the actions, combined with the thrill of having done something, but with a deep uncertainty that appears at the first break with the expected narrative. The role of dutiful protester had given these activists no indication of what to do when the barriers fell. Spectacular political confrontations like the Stop the War marches, the now familiar melees against the G20 or World Trade Organization, and the rousing scenes of democracy in Occupy Wall Street all give the appearance of being highly significant, as if something were genuinely at stake. Yet nothing changed, and long-term victories were traded for a simple registration of discontent. To outside observers, it is often not even clear what the movements want, beyond expressing generalized discontent with the world. The contemporary protest has become a melange of wild and varied demands. The 2009 G20 summit in London, for instance, featured protesters marching for issues that spanned from grandiose anti-capitalist stipulations to modest goals centered on more local issues. When demands can be discerned at all, they usually fail to articulate anything substantial. They are often nothing more than empty slogans, as meaningful as calling for world peace. In more recent struggles, the very idea of making demands has been questioned. The Occupy movement infamously struggled to articulate meaningful goals, worried that anything too substantial would be divisive. and a broad range of student occupations across the Western world has taken up the mantra of no demands under the misguided belief that demanding nothing is a radical act. When asked what the ultimate upshot of these actions has been, participants differ between admitting to a general sense of futility and pointing to the radicalization of those who took part. If we look at protests today as an exercise in public awareness, they appear to have had mixed success at best. Their messages are mangled by an unsympathetic media smitten by images of property destruction, assuming that the media even acknowledges a form of contention that has become increasingly repetitive and boring. Some argue that, rather than trying to achieve a certain end, these movements, protests and occupations in fact exist only for their own sake. The aim in this case is to achieve a certain transformation of the participants, and create a space outside of the usual operations of power. While there is a degree of truth to this, things like protest camps tend to remain ephemeral, small-scale and ultimately unable to challenge the larger structures of the neoliberal economic system. This is politics transmuted into pastime, politics as drug experience, perhaps, rather than anything capable of transforming society. Such protests are registered only in the minds of their participants, bypassing any transformation of social structures. While these efforts at radicalization and awareness raising are undoubtedly important to some degree, there still remains the question of exactly when these sequences might pay off. Is there a point at which a critical mass of consciousness raising will be ready for action? Protests can build connections, encourage hope and remind people of their power. Yet, beyond these transient feelings, politics still demands the exercise of that power, lest these effective bonds go to waste. If we will not act after one of the largest crises of capitalism, then when? The emphasis on the effective aspects of protests plays into a broader trend that has come to privilege the effective as the site of real politics. Bodily, emotional and visceral elements come to replace and stymie, rather than complement and enhance, more abstract analysis. The contemporary landscape of social media, for example, is littered with the bitter fallout from an endless torrent of outrage and anger. Given the individualism of current social media platforms, premised on the maintenance of an online identity, it is perhaps no surprise to see online politics tend towards the self-presentation of moral purity. We are more concerned to appear right than to think about the conditions of political change. Yet these daily outrages pass as rapidly as they emerge, and we are soon on to the next vitriolic crusade. In other places, public demonstrations of empathy with those suffering replace more finely tuned analysis, resulting in hasty or misplaced action, or none at all. While politics always has a relationship to emotion and sensation, to hope or anger, fear or outrage, when taken as the primary mode of politics, these impulses can lead to deeply perverse results. In a famous example, 1985's Live Aid raised huge amounts of money for famine relief through a combination of heartstring-tugging imagery and emotionally manipulative celebrity-led events. The sense of emergency demanded urgent action, at the expense of thought. Yet the money raised actually extended the civil war causing the famine, by allowing rebel militias to use the food aid to support themselves. While viewers at home felt comforted they were doing something rather than nothing, a dispassionate analysis revealed that they had in fact contributed to the problem. These unintended outcomes become even more pervasive as the targets of action grow larger and more abstract. If politics without passion leads to cold-hearted, bureaucratic technocracy, then passion bereft of analysis risks becoming a libidinally driven surrogate for effective action. Politics comes to be about feelings of personal empowerment, masking an absence of strategic gains. Perhaps most depressing, even when movements have some successes, they are in the context of overwhelming losses. Residents across the UK, for example, have successfully mobilised in particular cases to stop the closure of local hospitals. Yet these real successes are overwhelmed by larger plans to gut and privatise the National Health Service. Similarly, recent anti-fracking movements have been able to stop test drilling in various localities, but governments nevertheless continue to search for shale gas resources and provide support for companies to do so. In the United States, Various movements to stop evictions in the wake of the housing crisis have made real gains in terms of keeping people in their homes. Yet the perpetrators of the subprime mortgage debacle continue to reap the profits, waves of foreclosures continue to sweep across the country, and rents continue to surge across the urban world. Small successes, useful, no doubt, for instilling a sense of hope, nevertheless wither in the face of overwhelming losses. Even the most optimistic activist falters in the face of struggles that continue to fail. In other cases, well-intentioned projects like Rolling Jubilee strive to escape the spell of neoliberal common sense. The ostensibly radical aim of crowdsourcing money to pay the debts of the underprivileged means buying into a system of voluntary charity and redistribution, as well as accepting the legitimacy of the debt in the first place. In this respect, the initiative is one among a larger group of projects that act simply as crisis responses to the faltering of state services. These are survival mechanisms, not a desirable vision for the future. What can we conclude from all of this? The recent cycle of struggles has to be identified as one of overarching failure, despite a multitude of small-scale successes and moments of large-scale mobilization. The question that any analysis of the left today must grapple with is simply, what has gone wrong? It is undeniable that heightened repression by states and the increased power of corporations have played a significant role in weakening the power of the left. Still, it remains debatable whether the repression faced by workers, the precarity of the masses and the power of capitalists is any greater than it was in the late 19th century. Workers then were still struggling for basic rights, often against states more than willing to use lethal violence against them. But whereas that period saw mass mobilization, general strikes, militant labor and radical women's organizations all achieving real and lasting successes, today is defined by their absence. The recent weakness of the left cannot simply be chalked up to increased state and capitalist repression. An honest reckoning must accept that problems also lie within the left. One key problem is a widespread and uncritical acceptance of what we call folk political thinking. Defining folk politics. What is folk politics? Folk politics names a constellation of ideas and intuitions within the contemporary left that informs the common-sense ways of organizing, acting and thinking politics. It is a set of strategic assumptions that threatens to debilitate the left, rendering it unable to scale up, create lasting change or expand beyond particular interests. Leftist movements under the sway of folk politics are not only unlikely to be successful, they are in fact incapable of transforming capitalism. The term itself draws upon two senses of folk. First, it evokes critiques of folk psychology which argue that our intuitive conceptions of the world are both historically constructed and often mistaken. Secondly, it refers to folk as the locus of the small scale, the authentic, the traditional and the natural. Both of these dimensions are implied in the idea of folk politics. As a first approximation, we can therefore define folk politics as a collective and historically constructed political common sense that has become out of joint with the actual mechanisms of power. As our political, economic, social and technological world changes, tactics and strategies which were previously capable of transforming collective power into emancipatory gains have now become drained of their effectiveness. As the common sense of today's left, folk politics often operates intuitively, uncritically and unconsciously. Yet common sense is also historical and mutable. It is worth recalling that today's familiar forms of organization and tactics, far from being natural or pre-given, have instead been developed over time in response to specific political problems. Petitions, occupations, strikes, vanguard parties, affinity groups, trade unions, all arose out of particular historical conditions. Yet the fact that certain ways of organizing and acting were once useful does not guarantee their continued relevance. Many of the tactics and organizational structures that dominate the contemporary left are responses to the experience of state communism, exclusionary trade unions, and the collapse of social democratic parties. Yet the ideas that made sense in the wake of those moments no longer present effective tools for political transformation. Our world has moved on, becoming more complex, abstract, non-linear and global than ever before. Against the abstraction and inhumanity of capitalism, folk politics aims to bring politics down to the human scale by emphasizing temporal, spatial and conceptual immediacy. At its heart, folk politics is the guiding intuition that immediacy is always better and often more authentic, with the corollary being a deep suspicion of abstraction and mediation. In terms of temporal immediacy, contemporary folk politics typically remains reactive, responding to actions initiated by corporations and governments, rather than initiating actions, ignores long-term strategic goals in favor of tactics, mobilizing around single-issue politics or emphasizing process, prefers practices that are often inherently fleeting, such as occupations and temporary autonomous zones, chooses the familiarities of the past over the unknowns of the future, for instance, the repeated dreams of a return to good Keynesian capitalism, and expresses itself as a predilection for the voluntarist and spontaneous over the institutional, as in the romanticization of rioting and insurrection. In terms of spatial immediacy, folk politics privileges the local as the site of authenticity, as in the 100 miles diet or local currencies, habitually chooses the small over the large, as in the veneration of small-scale communities or local businesses, favors projects that are unscalable beyond a small community, for instance, general assemblies and direct democracy, and often rejects the project of hegemony, valuing withdrawal or exit rather than building a broad counter-hegemony. Likewise, folk politics prefers that actions be taken by participants themselves, in its emphasis on direct action, for example, and sees decision-making as something to be carried out by each individual rather than by any representative. The problems of scale and extension are either ignored or smoothed over in folk political thinking. Finally, in terms of conceptual immediacy, there is a preference for the everyday over the structural, valorizing personal experience over systematic thinking, for feeling over thinking, emphasizing individual suffering, or the sensations of enthusiasm and anger experienced during political actions, for the particular over the universal, seeing the latter as intrinsically totalitarian, and for the ethical over the political, as in ethical consumerism, or moralizing critiques of greedy bankers. Organizations and communities are to be transparent, rejecting in advance any conceptual mediation, or even modest amounts of complexity. The classic images of universal emancipation and global change have been transformed into a prioritization of the suffering of the particular and the authenticity of the local. As a result, any process of constructing a universal politics is rejected from the outset. Understood in these ways, we can detect traces of folk politics in organizations and movements like Occupy, Spain's 15M, student occupations, left communist insurrectionists like Tikhon and the Invisible Committee, most forms of horizontalism, the Zapatistas, and contemporary anarchist-tinged politics, as well as a variety of other trends like political localism, the slow food movement, and ethical consumerism, among many others. But no single position embodies all of these dispositions, which leads us to a first qualification: as an uncritical and often unconscious common sense, folk politics comes to be instantiated to varying degrees in concrete political positions. That is to say, folk politics does not name an explicit position, but only an implicit tendency. The ideas that characterize this tendency are widely dispersed throughout the contemporary left, but some positions are more folk political than others. This brings us to a second important qualification: the problem with folk politics is not that it starts from the local. All politics begins from the local. The problem is rather that folk political thinking is content to remain at, and even privileges, that level, of the transient, the small scale, the unmediated and the particular. It takes these to be sufficient rather than simply necessary moments. Therefore, the point is not simply to reject folk politics. Folk politics is a necessary component of any successful political project, but it can only be a starting point. A third qualification is that folk politics is only a problem for particular types of projects, those that seek to move beyond capitalism. Folk political thinking can be perfectly well adapted to other political projects, projects aimed solely at resistance, movements organized around local issues, and small-scale projects. Political movements based around keeping a hospital open or preventing evictions are all admirable, but they are importantly different from movements trying to challenge neoliberal capitalism. The idea that one organization, tactic or strategy applies equally well to any sort of struggle is one of the most pervasive and damaging beliefs among today's left. Strategic reflection, on means and ends, enemies and allies, is necessary before approaching any political project. Given the nature of global capitalism, any post-capitalist project will require an ambitious, abstract, mediated, complex and global approach, one that folk political approaches are incapable of providing. Combining these qualifications, we can therefore say that folk politics is necessary but insufficient for a post-capitalist political project. By emphasizing and remaining at the level of the immediate, folk politics lacks the tools to transform neoliberalism into something else. While folk politics can undoubtedly make important interventions in local struggles, we deceive ourselves when we think these are turning the tide against global capitalism. They represent, at best, temporary respite against its onslaught. The project of this book is to begin outlining an alternative, a way for the left to navigate from the local to the global, and synthesize the particular with the universal. Such an alternative cannot simply be a conservative reversion to the working-class politics of the last century. It must instead combine an updated way of thinking politics, a shift from immediacy to structural analysis, with an upgraded means of doing politics, which directs action towards building platforms and expanding scales. Overwhelmed. Why did folk politics arise in the first place? Why is it that folk political tendencies, for all their manifest flaws, are so seductive and appealing to the movements of today? At least 3 answers present themselves. The first explanation is to see folk politics as a response to the problem of how to interpret and act within an ever more complex world. The second, related explanation involves situating folk politics as a reaction to the historical experiences of the communist and social democratic left. Finally, folk politics is a more immediate response to the empty spectacle of contemporary party politics. Increasingly, multipolar global politics, economic instability, and anthropogenic climate change outpace the narratives we use to structure and make sense of our lives. Each of these is an example of what is termed a complex system, which features nonlinear dynamics, where marginally different inputs can cause dramatically divergent outputs, intricate sets of causes feedback on one another in unexpected ways, and which characteristically operates on scales of space and time that go far beyond any individual's unaided perception. Globalization, international politics, and climate change, each of these systems shapes our world, but their effects are so extensive and complicated that it is difficult to place our own experience within them. The global economy is a good example of this. In simple terms, the economy is not an object amenable to direct perception, it is distributed across time and space. You will never meet the economy in person. It incorporates a wide array of elements, from property laws to biological needs, natural resources to technological infrastructures, market stalls and supercomputers, and it involves an enormous and intricately interacting set of feedback loops, all of which produce emergent effects that are irreducible to its individual components. In other words, the interaction of an economy's parts produces effects that cannot be understood just by knowing how those parts work in isolation. It is only in grasping the relations between them that the economy can be made sense of. While we might have an idea of what an economy consists of, we will never be able to experience it directly in the same way as other phenomena. It can only be observed symptomatically through key statistical indexes, charting changes in inflation or interest rates, stock indexes, GDP, and so on, but can never be seen, heard or touched in its totality. As a result, despite everything that has been written about capitalism, we still struggle to understand its dynamics and its mechanisms. Most importantly, we lack a cognitive map of our socio-economic system, a mental picture of how individual and collective human action can be situated within the unimaginable vastness of the global economy. Recent decades have seen an increasing complexity in the dynamics that impinge upon politics. We might consider the imminent threat of anthropogenic climate change as a new kind of problem, one that is unamenable to any simple solution and that involves such intricately woven effects that it is hard to even know where to intervene. Equally, the global economy today appears significantly more complex in terms of the mobility of capital, the intricacies of global finance, and the multiplicity of actors involved. How well do our traditional political images of the world map onto these changes? For the left at least, an analysis premised on the industrial working class was a powerful way to interpret the totality of social and economic relations in the 19th and early 20th centuries, thereby articulating clear strategic objectives. Yet the history of the global left over the course of the 20th century attests to the ways in which this analysis failed to attend to both the range of possible liberating struggles, based in gender, race or sexuality, and the ability of capitalism to restructure itself, through the creation of the welfare state, or the neoliberal transformations of the global economy. Today, the old models often falter in the face of new problems. We lose the capacity to understand our position in history and in the world at large. This separation between everyday experience and the system we live within results in increased alienation. We feel adrift in a world we do not understand. The cultural theorist Frederick Jameson notes that the proliferation of conspiracy theories is partly a response to this situation. Conspiracy theories act by narrowing the agency behind our world to a single figure of power, the Bilderberg Group, the Freemasons, or some other convenient scapegoat. Despite the extraordinary complexity of some of these theories, they nevertheless provide a reassuringly simple answer to who is behind it all, and what our own role is in the situation. In other words, they act precisely as a faulty cognitive map. Folk politics presents itself as another possible response to the problems of overwhelming complexity. If we do not understand how the world operates, the folk political injunction is to reduce complexity down to a human scale. Indeed, folk political writing is saturated with calls for a return to authenticity, to immediacy, to a world that is transparent, human-scaled, tangible, slow, harmonious, simple, and everyday. Such thinking rejects the complexity of the contemporary world, and thereby rejects the possibility of a truly post-capitalist world. It attempts to give a human face to power, whereas what is truly terrifying is the generally a subjective nature of the system. The faces are interchangeable, the power remains the same. The turn towards localism, temporary moments of resistance, and the intuitive practices of direct action all effectively attempt to condense the problems of global capitalism into concrete figures and moments. In this process, folk politics often reduces politics to an ethical and individual struggle. There is a tendency sometimes to imagine that we simply need good capitalists, or a responsible capitalism. At the same time, the imperative to make it local leads folk politics to fetishize immediate results and the concrete appearance of action. Delaying a corporate attack on the environment, for instance, is lauded as a success, even if the company simply waits out public attention before returning once again. Moreover, as Rosa Luxemburg pointed out long ago, the fetishization of immediate results leads to an empty pragmatism that struggles to maintain the present balance of power, rather than seeking to change structural conditions. Without the necessary abstraction of strategic thought, tactics are ultimately fleeting gestures. Finally, the abjuring of complexity dovetails with the neoliberal case for markets. One of the primary arguments made against planning has been that the economy is simply too complex to be guided. The only alternative is therefore to leave the distribution of resources to the market and reject any attempt to guide it rationally. Considered in all these ways, folk politics appears as an attempt to make global capitalism small enough to be thinkable, and at the same time, to articulate how to act upon this restricted image of capitalism. By contrast, the argument of this book is that folk political tendencies are mistaken. If complexity presently outstrips humanity's capacities to think and control, there are two options: one is to reduce complexity down to a human scale, the other is to expand humanity's capacities. We endorse the latter position. Any post-capitalist project will necessarily require the creation of new cognitive maps, political narratives, technological interfaces, economic models, and mechanisms of collective control to be able to marshal complex phenomena for the betterment of humanity. Outdated. While the response to increasing complexity goes some way towards explaining the rise of folk political thinking, it must also be situated in terms of the particular history of left politics in the 20th century. In many respects, folk political tendencies are understandable, if inadequate, responses to the challenges faced in the last 50 years, challenges that have emerged both within the left and in competition with conservative and capitalist forces. In particular, folk politics emerged as a response to the collapse of the post-war social democratic complex that knitted together working-class institutions, social democratic parties, and the hegemony of embedded liberalism. The breakdown of this social democratic bloc occurred across multiple lines of conflict and in various spheres, in the emergence of new forms of work, associated with the affective and cognitive, in the emergence of energy crises that disrupted geopolitical certainties, in the increasing difficulties capitalist enterprises faced in achieving profitability, in the proliferation of neoliberal ideology through the institutional networks of think tanks and university departments, in the explosion of new forms of political subjectivities, projects and demands, and in the widespread discrediting of nominally communist states. Each of these factors served to disrupt the foundation of the post-war social system in Europe and America. In this process, there was both an outdating of old left paradigms and an outmaneuvering of the new ones. Perhaps the most significant point in this destabilization of the post-war settlement was in the late 1960s and early 1970s. The global revolts of 1968 gave both new prominence and new inspiration to a series of left movements that rejected the coordinates of struggle articulated by labor unions and political parties. These movements were driven partly by the emerging history of Stalinist repression, and when combined with the Soviet regime's suppression of democratizing currents in Eastern Europe, this meant that communist parties were increasingly discredited in the eyes of young European leftists. This called into question the strategic validity of the Leninist program of state takeover by a revolutionary party leading a coalition of forces centered on the industrial working class. If even successful revolutions led to sclerotic technocracy and political repression in the long term, what then was to be the properly emancipatory course of action? Hierarchy and vanguardism in the Communist Party increasingly appeared opposed to the aims of the emerging social movements. Beyond the difficulties of transitioning to post-capitalism under a communist administration, the prospects for state takeover in the developed nations in the 1960s and 1970s seemed slight, especially given the divisions emerging on the left. The uprisings in France in May 1968, in which the French Communist Party notably failed to back the Unionists and student groups, seemingly brought to an end any prospect of a political revolution. In addition, social democracy and its Keynesian corporatist solutions to social inequity appeared increasingly content with the existing order, and unable or unwilling to move towards an emancipatory socialism. Though social democracy was capable of offering significant gains to certain groups, it retained an authoritarian establishment and a paternalistic caste, generally exclusive of women and ethnic minorities, and was dependent upon a mode of capitalist organization, Fordism, that generated unusual levels of social cohesion. It was this social cohesion that was eroded in the late 1960s and early 1970s by the emergence of new mass desires, for increased flexibility in work, for example, and newly insistent demands, for racial and gender equality, for nuclear disarmament, for sexual freedoms, and against Western imperialism. By the late 1960s, these new problems could no longer be resolved with the existing set of leftist political agents, and electoral pressures were beginning to transform the Social Democratic Party from a mass party of the working class into an increasingly coalition-based party of the middle class. The remaining radical elements of social democratic parties were being slowly hollowed out. The ongoing decline of the party form can be traced partly to the disastrous realities of rule in the nominally communist states and the disappointment of social democracy. At the same time, a series of well-founded critiques were marshaled from within the New Left, prompted partly by the experiences of women in activist groups, who found their voices continued to be marginalized even in allegedly radical organizations. More hierarchical organizational forms, such as parties or traditional union organizations, continued to entrench the predominant patriarchal and sexist social relations prevalent in broader society. Considerable experimentation was therefore conducted to produce new organizational forms that could work against this social repression. This included the use of consensus decision-making and horizontal debating structures that would later come to worldwide fame with the Occupy Wall Street movement. Outside of feminist groups, the new student left of the university campuses, while diverse in its manifestations, was often explicitly anti-authoritarian, anti-bureaucratic, and even anti-organizational. Many of the tactics espoused by these groups emphasized the benefits of direct action and drew their influences from African American civil rights movements and earlier student movements, as well as from the ideas of European situationism, anarchist political currents, and the incipient environmental movement. Here we can see the emergence of folk politics' basic strategic orientation and the modes of action that characterize it, from the occupation, sit-in, or squatted commune through to carnivalesque street protests and happenings. Each of these tactics emerged in this period as a way to disrupt the functioning of everyday power, suspend the normal forms of social regulation and promote egalitarian spaces for discussion. Beyond trying to change society, these interventions aimed at transforming the participants themselves and embodying the new forms of sociality to come. The movements that crystallized in the period were therefore diverse in their makeup and outlook, operating across various subjectivities, territorial locations, and tactical and strategic forms. But each of them, in its own way, articulated new desires that could not readily be accommodated within the old forms of left-wing politics. One way to consider these movements is as part of a generalized anti-systemic political phenomenon of the time. Across the globe, there was a tendency towards challenging and taking apart the power of bureaucratic hierarchies in favor of new modes of direct action, extending from the student, feminist and Black Power movements of the United States, through to the situationist movement, student and allied labor movements of Europe, Prague's anti-Stalinists, the student revolts of Mexico and Tokyo, and China's Cultural Revolution. At its most extreme, however, this anti-systemic politics led towards the identification of political power as inherently tainted by oppressive, patriarchal and domineering tendencies. This leaves something of a paradox. On the one hand, it could choose some form of negotiation or accommodation with existing power structures, which would tend towards the corruption or cooptation of the new left. But on the other hand, it could choose to remain marginal, and thereby unable to transform those elements of society not already convinced of its agenda. The critiques many of these anti-systemic movements made of established forms of state, capitalist and old left bureaucratic power were largely accurate. Yet anti-systemic politics offered few resources to build a new movement capable of contending against capitalist hegemony. The legacy of these social movements was therefore two-sided. The ideas, values and new desires articulated by them had a significant impact on a global level. The dissemination of feminist, anti-racist, gay rights and anti-bureaucratic demands remains their strongest achievement. In this, they represented an absolutely necessary moment of self-critique by the left, and the legacy of folk political tactics finds its appropriate historical conditions here. Simultaneously, however, an inability or lack of desire to turn the more radical sides of these projects into hegemonic ones also had important consequences for the period of destabilization that followed. While capable of generating an array of new and powerful ideas of human freedom, the new social movements were generally unable to replace the faltering social democratic order. Outmaneuvered. Just as the new social movements were on the rise, the economic basis of the social democratic consensus was beginning to fall apart. The 1970s saw surging energy prices, the collapse of the Bretton Woods system, the growth of global capital flows, persistent stagflation and falling capitalist profits. This effectively ended the basic political settlement that had supported the post-war era, the that unique nexus of Keynesian economic policy, Fordist corporatist industrial production, and the broadly social democratic consensus that returned a part of the social surplus back to workers. Across the world, the structural crisis presented an opportunity for the forces of both the broad left and the broad right to generate a new hegemony that could resolve it. For the right, the challenge was to restore capital accumulation and profitability. This challenge was eventually answered by the emergence of neoliberal thought on the global stage, but even before that, right-wing forces in the UK and the United States were experimenting with new ways to outmaneuver both the old and new left. One particularly important approach was a political economic strategy to link the crisis of capitalism to union power. The subsequent defeat of organized labor throughout the core capitalist nations has perhaps been neoliberalism's most important achievement, significantly changing the balance of power between labor and capital. The means by which this was achieved were diverse, from physical confrontation and combat, to using legislation to undermine solidarity and industrial action, to embracing shifts in production and distribution that compromised union power, such as disaggregating supply chains, to re-engineering public opinion and consent around a broadly neoliberal agenda of individual freedom and negative solidarity. The latter denotes more than mere indifference to worker agitations, it is the fostering of an aggressively enraged sense of injustice, committed to the idea that, because I must endure increasingly austere working conditions, wage freezes, loss of benefits, a declining pension pot, then everyone else must as well. The result of these combined shifts was a hollowing out of unions and the defeat of the working class in the developed world. While the right successfully faced the structural crisis by consolidating its political and economic power, the movements of the old and new left were unable to confront this new configuration of forces. In the 1970s, socialist and even communist political parties were gradually able to gain increasing ground in elections in Western Europe, but the old left simply tried to resolve the crisis by doubling down on the traditional corporatist agenda. But the old Keynesian policy formulations were unable to kickstart growth, restrain unemployment, or reduce inflation under these new economic conditions. As a result, left-wing governments coming to power in the 1970s, such as the British Labour Party, often ended up having to implement proto-neoliberal policies in frustrated attempts to foster a recovery. The traditional labour movement, decrepit and stagnant, was by now being bested and co-opted by the forces of the right. In this context, the new left was a necessary critique that was essential to the left's revitalization and progress. Yet, as we saw in the previous section, if the old labor organizations were in many senses bereft of ideas, the new left was unable to institutionalize itself and articulate a counter-hegemony. The result was a left that became increasingly marginalized. As neoliberalism expanded and consolidated its common sense, the remaining social democratic parties increasingly came to accept neoliberalism's terms. With most major parties effectively signed up to its political and economic program, and increasing numbers of public services being taken into private hands, the ability to achieve significant change at the ballot box was dramatically reduced. Widespread cynicism began to accompany a hollowed-out party politics that came to resemble the public relations industry, with politicians being reduced to the role of shopkeepers hawking undesirable wares. Mass participation in electoral politics declined in tandem with the gradual acceptance of the neoliberal coordinates, and the age of post-politics was upon us. Mass voter disaffection is the result today, with voter turnout routinely at historic lows. Under these circumstances, the folk political insistence on immediate results and small-scale participatory democracy has an obvious allure. The position of the new social movements in this context was more ambiguous. By the 1990s, the positioning of the working class as privileged political subject had been fully broken down, and a much wider array of social identities, desires and oppressions had gained recognition. Increasingly sophisticated attempts were made to develop the analysis of interacting power structures, giving rise to ideas of intersectional oppressions. As a result of cultural dissemination and mainstream political endorsement, Large parts of the programs of feminist, anti-racist and queer political movements had become enshrined in law and embraced on a social level. But despite these successes, there had been a rollback from the kind of radical demands outlined in the 1970s, which envisaged a much more thorough transformation of society. Feminists, for example, have made significant gains in terms of pay equality, abortion rights and childcare policies, but these pale in comparison to projects for the total abolition of gender. Similarly, for many Black liberation movements, while anti-racist employment policies and anti-discrimination laws were widely enacted, they had not been accompanied by other radical programs espoused by earlier movements. Much of the success seen by the new social movements today is confined within the hegemonic terms established by neoliberalism, articulated around market-centered claims, liberal rights and a rhetoric of choice. What have been sidelined in the process are the more radical and anti-capitalist elements of these projects. Looking back, we have the collapse of the traditional organizations of the left, and the simultaneous rise of an alternative new left predicated upon critiques of bureaucracy, verticality, exclusion and institutionalization, combined with an incorporation of some of the new desires into the apparatus of neoliberalism. It was against this backdrop that folk political intuitions increasingly sedimented as a new common sense and came to be expressed in the alter-globalization movements. These movements emerged in two phases. The first, appearing from the mid-1990s through to the early 2000s, consisted of groups such as the Zapatistas, anti-capitalists, alter-globalizers, and participants in the World Social Forum and global anti-war protests. A second phase began immediately after the 2007 to 2009 financial crisis and featured various groups united by their similar organizational forms and ideological positions, including the Occupy movement, Spain's 15M and various national-level student movements. Both phases of the newest social movements sought to counter neoliberalism and its national and corporate avatars, with the first phase targeting global trade and governance organizations, and the latter focusing more on financialization, inequality and debt. Drawing influence from the earlier social movements, this latest cycle of struggles comprises groups that tend to privilege the local and the spontaneous, the horizontal and the anti-state. The apparent plausibility of folk politics rests on the collapse of traditional modes of organization on the left, of the co-optation of social democratic parties into a choiceless neoliberal hegemony, and the broad sense of disempowerment engendered by the insipidness of contemporary party politics. In a world where the most serious problems we face seem intractably complex, folk politics presents an alluring way to prefigure egalitarian futures in the present. On its own, however, this kind of politics is unable to give rise to long-lasting forces that might supersede, rather than merely resist, global capitalism. Looking forward. The critique of folk politics advanced in this book is as much a warning as it is a diagnosis. The existing tendencies in the mainstream and radical left are moving towards the folk political pole, and we seek to reverse this trend. The aim of the first half of the book is therefore to disrupt an increasingly dogmatic set of principles about how to strategize and do politics today. Beginning with a critical take on existing politics, Chapter 2 seeks to diagnose and outline the limits of contemporary folk political thinking. While the left has rejected the project of hegemony and expansion, Chapter 3 shows how neoliberalism successfully took the opposite path. In the place of folk politics, the second half will suggest an alternative leftist project organized around global and universal emancipation. Chapter 4 argues that a future-orientated left needs to reclaim the initiative for modernization and its emphasis on progress and universal emancipation. Chapter 5 sets out an analysis of the tendencies of contemporary capitalism, emphasizing the crisis of work and social reproduction. These tendencies demand a response, and our argument is that the left should begin mobilizing a political project to direct these forces in a progressive manner. In contrast to today's dominant focus on debt and inequality, Chapter 6 envisions a post-work world. Chapters 7 and 8 examine some of the steps that will need to be taken to achieve this vision, which include building a counter-hegemonic movement and rebuilding the capacities of the left. Finally, the conclusion takes a step back to examine the project of modernity from the perspective of a future-orientated left guided by the goal of universal emancipation. This book is predicated on a simple belief, that a modern left can neither continue with the current system nor return to an idealized past, but must instead face up to the task of building a new future.